She laughed the moment I fell, the sound sharp and brittle like breaking glass, echoing through the kitchen that used to hold our laughter and stories. It wasn't a kind laugh. It wasn't even a surprised laugh. It was the kind of laugh that sinks into your bones and refuses to leave, the kind that shatters what little dignity you thought you had left. "You're so slow," she said, her voice laced with something that felt like contempt disguised as amusement, like one of those old phones that freeze and glitch, always a step behind. That was my daughter, the woman I had raised and loved, standing over me as I struggled to find balance on the cold linoleum floor. I'm 78 years old now, and I live alone in a house filled with memories that sometimes feel like both a blessing and a burden. This kitchen, with its peeling linoleum and chipped wooden cupboards, still smells faintly of the dinners I once made for her. The scents of cinnamon and roasted chicken clinging stubbornly to the air. It was our shared space once. But that day, when she laughed as I fell, it became the stage for something much darker. The quiet unveiling of a truth I had tried to deny. That I was no longer seen as her mother, but as a problem, an inconvenience, an obstacle to be mocked. The years had carved their marks on me. The slow creak of joints, the tremor in my hands, the unevenness in my step. But I never imagined that age would become a weapon wielded so coldly by the person who should have been my greatest protector. I remember the day vividly, not because it was extraordinary, but precisely because it was so ordinary, so quietly devastating. She had come to visit with my granddaughter, saying it would only be for a couple of days. But as days stretched into weeks, the atmosphere grew heavy with an unspoken tension. Every interaction became a minefield of small jabs disguised as jokes and critiques disguised as concern. "Maybe you should sit down more," she would say, watching me carefully as I reached for a glass or tried to steady myself on a slippery patch. "You're dropping things again," she'd comment casually, when I spilled a bit of tea or let a dish slip from my hands. The house was no longer a home, but a stage where I was being judged, monitored, and dismissed. The granddaughter, once bright-eyed and curious, seemed to adopt the same detached stance, her glance sliding past me as if I were part of the wallpaper, unnoticed and unimportant. I felt myself shrinking under the weight of it, as if the space I occupied was being claimed by a shadow of indifference and impatience. That fall was not sudden, but rather the culmination of months of subtle erasure. I had noticed the shift long before I landed on the floor that morning. The silences that stretched longer than they used to. The way my daughter's eyes would flicker away when I looked for reassurance. The growing absence of warmth in her tone. I had lived through decades of loving and caregiving, raising her with the patience and devotion only a mother knows, and yet here I was, reduced to a spectacle. A slow, clumsy relic of the past. When I finally slipped, the sound of my body hitting the floor seemed to resonate deeper than the kitchen tiles. It was the echo of all the times I had been invisible, dismissed, and forgotten. She didn't rush to help me, didn't reach out her hand with concern or worry. Instead, she pulled out her phone and snapped a picture, her laugh ringing loud enough to fill the empty spaces of my heart. "Mom," she said, barely stifling a grin, "you're like a joke from those silly internet videos. Everyone's going to love this." The words stung sharper than any fall could have. In that moment, the warmth I had once felt in her presence was replaced by a cold, clinical distance that cut through me like a blade. I lay there, feeling the sting of bruises, both physical and emotional, and I understood something I had resisted admitting for far too long. The daughter I loved was no longer the person who would care for me in my vulnerability. I was not just old and slow. I was a source of amusement, a burden to be managed, a faded memory best kept at a safe distance. The realization settled like dust over everything I thought I knew about family, love, and the bonds that were supposed to hold us together. How did it come to this? How did the woman who once clung to my hand as a child, who sought comfort in my embrace, become someone who mocked my pain and disregarded my dignity? I think back to the countless mornings I woke before dawn to prepare breakfast, the evenings I stayed up sewing costumes for school plays, the nights I sat by her bedside during fevers and heartbreaks. All those years of being a mother seemed to unravel in a single cruel moment, the laughter echoing as a reminder that time had changed everything, except the hardness in some hearts. Living alone now, in the quiet that fills my days and nights, I carry the weight of that fall not only on my body, but deep within my spirit. The kitchen, once the heart of the home, now feels like a silent witness to the fracture that widened between us. Yet even in this solitude, I find moments of clarity and strength, a fierce resolve that perhaps I am more than the sum of their dismissals. Aging is not a curse, nor is it a punchline. It is a journey, one I am still walking with as much grace and courage as I can muster. This story isn't just about a fall on a kitchen floor. It's about the way love can fracture, the way roles shift, and the way the very people we trust can sometimes become the source of our deepest wounds. It's about reclaiming dignity when it feels lost, about standing up when the world expects you to stay down. And above all, it's about the quiet power of resilience, the kind that builds slowly in the cracks of loneliness and shame, until one day you realize you have been holding yourself up all along. If you listen closely, this kitchen still whispers the echoes of my fall and my rise, a testament not just to what was broken, but to what was never truly lost. The moment she laughed when I fell in the kitchen was not an isolated incident, but the sharp turning point in a series of moments that had been quietly unraveling the fragile threads holding us together. It was the culmination of a long, unspoken drift that neither of us dared to name aloud, but which was felt in every glance, every word left unsaid, and every small act of neglect that accumulated like dust in the corners of our shared space. That day, as I lay there on the cold linoleum floor, her laughter ringing through the room, I realized with painful clarity that the person who should have been my daughter had become a stranger who saw me not as her mother, but as an obstacle, a source of irritation, and ultimately something to be ridiculed. This shift was not sudden. It had been gathering force in the background of our interactions, like a slow tide pulling away from the shore, leaving me stranded and exposed. For years, I had been the anchor of our family, the one who held the pieces together when storms came, who softened the sharp edges of life with love and care. I cooked the meals, wiped the tears, and mended the broken things, not just toys and clothes, but hearts and hopes. I never imagined that one day my presence would become a weight too heavy to bear, that my age and frailty would transform from reasons for tenderness into excuses for mockery. The day she laughed, I understood that the line between love and cruelty can sometimes be thinner than the skin that covers an aging bone, and just as easily crossed. The kitchen, once a sanctuary filled with the aroma of home-cooked meals and laughter, had turned into a battlefield where dignity was the first casualty. Her laughter was not just a sound. It was a verdict that echoed in the hollow spaces where respect and care should have lived. In the weeks leading up to that day, I noticed the subtle signs of change that I had chosen to ignore, perhaps out of hope or denial. She arrived for what she said would be a short visit, a few days to catch up and see her grandmother. But those days stretched into weeks without explanation or apology. With each passing day, her tone grew sharper, her patience thinner, and her smile more forced. Comments that might have once been brushed off as thoughtless jabs began to sting deeply, revealing a pattern of dismissal and disregard. She criticized my cooking, pointed out my forgetfulness, and questioned my ability to manage the simplest tasks. It was as if she was trying to rewrite the history of our relationship, erasing the years of sacrifice and devotion, and replacing them with impatience and contempt. My granddaughter, who used to cling to my hand and ask endless questions, now glanced at me with a look of distant politeness, as if I were a relic from another time. She followed her mother's lead, mimicking the same lack of warmth and the same carefully practiced indifference. The house, which had once been a place of comfort and connection, felt cold and foreign. I found myself retreating into the corners of rooms, shrinking into the background as if to become invisible, hoping that if I stayed quiet and small enough, I might escape the sting of their judgment. But invisibility brought no peace, only a growing ache in my chest and the slow erosion of my sense of self. The fall itself was both literal and symbolic. I slipped on a patch of spilled juice, a careless accident that could have happened to anyone, yet the way she reacted turned it into a moment of cruelty. Instead of reaching out to help me, she pulled out her phone and took a picture, capturing my stumble not as a moment of vulnerability, deserving compassion, but as a spectacle worthy of ridicule. Her laughter was harsh, sharp, and unrelenting, filling the room with a noise that drowned out the quiet groan of my body against the floor. "You're like an internet meme," she said, voice dripping with mockery, slow, clumsy, and a little embarrassing. The words landed like blows, cutting through the fabric of the mother-daughter bond we had once shared. In the aftermath, I felt a numbness spread through me, a protective shield against the pain that threatened to overwhelm. I stayed on the floor longer than I needed to, not because I was hurt beyond recovery, but because I needed to collect myself, to gather the shattered pieces of my dignity and place them back inside the fragile container of my heart. The silence that followed her laughter was heavy, filled with the absence of apology or concern. It was a silence that said more than any words could, that I was alone, forgotten, and no longer valued. That moment marked a profound rupture, the point at which I realized that the role I had played all my life was being cast aside, replaced by a new reality in which I was no longer the cherished mother, but a source of irritation and shame. This catalyst forced me to confront painful truths about the nature of love and aging. It showed me that family ties, no matter how strong, can fray and break under the weight of unspoken resentments and unmet expectations. It revealed the stark reality that sometimes those we love most are the ones who hurt us the deepest, not out of malice, but out of a blindness born of their own frustrations and fears. The laughter that echoed in the kitchen that day was not just a sound, but a turning point, a moment when the delicate balance of care and neglect tipped irrevocably toward abandonment. Yet within that rupture, there was also the seed of awakening. As I lay on that cold floor, bruised and humiliated, a quiet determination began to take root inside me. I understood then that if I were to survive this betrayal, I would need to reclaim my strength and dignity on my own terms. I could no longer rely on the family who had turned away, but I could still choose how to carry myself forward. That choice was not easy, and it came with the bitter knowledge that the path ahead might be lonely and uncertain. But it was mine to make, and it was a beginning. In the days that followed, I found myself retreating from their presence, from the house that no longer felt like home, and from the memories that now carried the weight of pain. I began to look inward, to search for a sense of self that was independent of their judgments and dismissals. The fall in the kitchen was not just a moment of physical vulnerability. It was a call to action, a signal that I could no longer live in the shadow of neglect and scorn. It was the moment I decided to stand up, not just from the floor, but from the silence and invisibility that had defined so much of my later years. This catalyst moment, painful and raw, is the spark that ignited the story of reclaiming my life. It forced me to see the truth of my situation, to face the loneliness that had been growing quietly beneath the surface, and to make the first hesitant steps toward healing and independence. The laughter that once threatened to break me became, in time, a reminder of the strength I needed to find within myself, the strength to rise, to speak, and to be seen again. Though the kitchen still holds the memory of that fall, it also holds the memory of my decision to refuse to be diminished any longer. It is a place marked by both pain and the promise of renewal, where the past and future collide in the quiet resilience of a woman who refuses to be forgotten. After that day in the kitchen, when her laughter still echoed in my ears like a bitter wind cutting through bare branches, something inside me shifted quietly, but irrevocably. It was not a sudden rebellion, nor an outburst of anger, but rather a slow, steady unraveling of the thread that had tied me to the life I once knew. The life where I was the caregiver, the center of the family, the woman whose presence was expected, if not always welcomed, then at least acknowledged. The fall had revealed the sharp edges of indifference I had been trying to ignore, and as the days passed, those edges grew harder, more defined, and increasingly impossible to overlook. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and gathering, became a silent witness to my gradual erasure from the fabric of their lives. I began to notice the small changes that signaled a larger pattern. The way my daughter no longer asked if I wanted tea or if I needed help carrying a plate. How my granddaughter no longer waited to hear my stories or shared her secrets in whispered tones while we baked cookies. How the invitations to family dinners became fewer until they stopped altogether. It was as if I was becoming a shadow in my own home, a faint outline that blurred and faded with every passing week. The warmth of belonging was replaced by a chilly distance that I could neither warm nor bridge. I found myself retreating more and more into the quiet corners of the house, where I could be alone with my thoughts and the ache of loneliness that grew heavier with each silence. One morning, I sat by the window watching the sunlight spill onto the garden, feeling the weight of years settle deep into my bones. The roses, once pruned and tended with care, had grown wild and untamed, much like the feelings stirring within me. I thought about the times when I had been the one to chase after the children, to soothe scraped knees and broken hearts, to mend fences, both literal and figurative. Now the roles had reversed in the most painful way. I was the one left needing care, needing kindness, and instead I was met with avoidance and dismissal. My body ached in places I hadn't noticed before, reminders of age that I had tried to deny, and yet the harder I tried to hold on to my place in their lives, the more I felt myself slipping away. I tried to speak up gently at first, suggesting that perhaps we could have dinner together, or that I could babysit for a few hours so they could have a break. Each time, the response was polite but firm. "We're busy. Maybe another time. We'll let you know." The words were polite, but the message was clear. I was no longer essential. I remember one particular evening when I called my daughter to ask if she needed help preparing for a school event, a small gesture that once would have been welcomed. She sighed heavily and said, "Mom, we've got it covered. You don't need to worry about these things anymore." That phrase, "don't need to worry anymore," stuck with me, a quiet dismissal that echoed louder than any argument could have. The house, filled once with the sounds of bustling family life, grew quieter. The TV became my companion, flickering images that provided distraction but no comfort. I found myself spending more time in the garden, the only place where I felt a measure of control and peace. Digging in the dirt, feeling the earth crumble beneath my fingers, reminded me of something solid, something real. But even there, the memories of laughter and shared moments haunted me, mingling with the scent of damp soil and blooming flowers. The garden was a refuge, but it was also a reminder of what had been lost. One afternoon, while tidying up the kitchen, I found the photograph album we used to pore over together. The pages were filled with pictures of birthdays, holidays, and everyday moments. Frozen smiles and laughter that seemed from another lifetime. I traced my fingers over a photo of my daughter as a little girl, her face glowing with innocence and trust as she leaned against me. The contrast between then and now was a chasm I struggled to cross. I wondered when the shift had happened, when love had turned into neglect, care into coldness. The album felt heavy in my hands, a testament to a history I cherished but no longer seemed to be a part of. The hardest moments were the ones that came without warning: a missed phone call, a canceled visit, a forgotten birthday. Each absence was a small wound, barely visible but accumulating until the pain was undeniable. I learned to hide my hurt behind smiles and quiet acceptance, not wanting to burden them with my sadness. But inside, the loneliness grew like a slow fire, consuming the edges of my hope. I realized that I was no longer part of their plans, no longer the one they called first or depended upon. I was becoming a bystander in my own life, watching as the distance widened and the warmth faded. One evening, as I prepared a simple meal for myself, I heard the front door open and close softly. My daughter and granddaughter had arrived later than usual, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. I set the table quietly, avoiding their eyes, hoping to keep the peace. But the evening unfolded with awkward silences and forced conversation, punctuated by sharp remarks disguised as jokes. My granddaughter spilled her juice, and my daughter rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath about clumsiness. The words pierced me, and yet I held my tongue, swallowing the sting so that the fragile peace wouldn't shatter completely. That night, lying in bed with the ceiling fan humming above me, I thought about the years we had shared, the love and laughter that once filled our home. I mourned not just the loss of their affection, but the loss of myself, the woman who had given so much and now received so little in return. But amid the sorrow, a quiet determination began to grow. I knew that if I wanted to be seen and heard again, I would have to change the story. I couldn't wait for them to remember me. I had to remember myself. Slowly, I began to reclaim parts of my life that had been neglected, reading books that stirred my spirit, reconnecting with old friends and finding joy in small, solitary moments. I took walks in the neighborhood, feeling the cool breeze on my face and the steady rhythm of my own footsteps beneath me. Each step was a reminder that I was still here, still moving forward, even if the path was uncertain. I began to write in a journal, pouring out the thoughts and feelings I had kept bottled up for so long. The pages became a mirror reflecting not just pain, but resilience and hope. I also began to set gentle boundaries, not with anger or confrontation, but with quiet firmness. When my daughter made snide comments, I would respond with calm honesty, refusing to accept the dismissal without a voice. When I was excluded from family events, I stopped waiting by the phone for an invitation that never came. These small acts of self-respect were like seeds planted in the soil of my new life, growing slowly but surely into something strong. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at the woman reflected back. The lines etched by years, the silver strands woven through dark hair, the eyes that had seen so much joy and sorrow. I smiled softly, a smile that carried both sadness and strength. I was still here, still whole, and still worthy of love and respect. The fall in the kitchen had been a painful awakening, but it had also been a beginning. This first escalation was not a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, quiet erosion of my place in their lives, a fading into the background that left me feeling invisible yet determined. It was a turning point that forced me to face the reality of my situation and sparked the journey toward reclaiming my dignity and independence. Though the laughter and neglect had wounded me deeply, they had also awakened a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. And in that resilience, I found the courage to begin walking away from what no longer served me and toward a life defined not by others' judgments, but by my own strength. The turning point did not announce itself with fanfare or dramatic declarations, but rather crept in quietly, like the first light of dawn slipping through the curtains of a long, dark night. After weeks of retreating into shadows and silences, I found myself standing at the edge of something unfamiliar but undeniable. A possibility that life could unfold differently, even now, when everything I had known seemed to be slipping away. It began one morning when I woke earlier than usual, the house still wrapped in the hush of dawn, and felt an urge to do something I hadn't done in years, to move with intention, to take control of the small corners of my world that had been neglected for too long. That day, I washed the kitchen floor myself, not out of obligation, but as a symbolic act, a reclaiming of space and agency. I scrubbed the linoleum with determination, working through the stubborn stains and scuffs until the surface gleamed faintly under the soft light. I knew the floor was slippery when wet. I remembered how easy it was to lose footing there. But I did not call out a warning to anyone. I simply cleaned and watched. This act, simple and unassuming to any outsider, held within it a quiet power. It was my way of telling the world, and perhaps more importantly, myself, that I was no longer willing to be the invisible, powerless woman who took the falls and endured the mockery in silence. There was a message embedded in the careful motion of my hands and the steady rhythm of the sponge against the floor. I had not forgotten. I had not forgiven, and I would not be caught off guard again. I did not know then if she would slip, if the past would come crashing back in a moment of reckoning, but I was ready to face whatever came with the clarity of someone who had tasted both pain and resolve. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle shifts in myself that surprised me. I found a new steadiness in my step, a sharper focus in my thoughts, and a calmness in my voice that was not there before. I began to assert myself in small ways, speaking up when dismissed, setting boundaries where none had existed, and refusing to shrink to fit the expectations others had imposed on me. It was not a dramatic rebellion, but a gradual reclaiming of my space and my story. I started attending a local community center's morning gatherings, where I met other women who, like me, were navigating the complex landscapes of aging, loneliness, and family estrangement. Their stories echoed my own, and in their company, I found a balm for my isolation and a mirror for my resilience. One afternoon, as I sat knitting quietly among the group, a woman named Eleanor struck up a conversation that would become a turning point in its own right. She was a few years younger, with sharp eyes and a laugh that reached her whole face, lighting up even the dullest days. Eleanor had been through a similar estrangement with her own daughter, a painful separation that had left deep scars, but also opened doors to unexpected friendships and self-discovery. We shared stories, tears, and moments of laughter, weaving a new tapestry of connection that reminded me I was not alone in this journey. That sense of belonging, fragile yet real, gave me the courage to keep moving forward. At home, I began to make changes that reflected this new chapter. I rearranged the furniture to create spaces where I could sit and read in the sunlight, placed fresh flowers on the kitchen table, and opened the windows to let the breeze carry away stale memories. I bought myself a new coat, a simple navy wool one with deep pockets and a subtle pattern, something that felt like armor and invitation all at once. Wearing it, I felt a surge of pride and comfort, as if the fabric itself whispered promises of renewal and self-respect. The act of choosing it, paying for it with my own money, was a declaration that I still had worth, still had the right to care for myself in ways that mattered. The emotional weight I carried from the years of neglect and dismissal did not disappear overnight, but I began to hold it differently. Instead of letting it crush me, I let it shape me into someone who could stand in her own light, however dim or flickering it might be. I found joy in small victories, a kind word from a neighbor, a smile from a stranger, the quiet satisfaction of a day spent tending to myself. The kitchen, once a symbol of humiliation, slowly became a place where I could nourish not just my body, but my spirit. I cooked meals for myself without waiting for approval or company, savoring the taste of independence in every bite. This midpoint marked the beginning of a profound internal shift. The fall in the kitchen, the laughter that followed, and the months of silence had forced me to confront the painful truth of my relationships. But they also awakened a strength I had forgotten I possessed. I was no longer willing to be defined by their rejection or to carry the burden of their indifference. Instead, I chose to define myself by the resilience born in the cracks of my broken world. It was not a story of revenge or bitterness, but one of quiet dignity and self-acceptance. I began to write letters, not to my daughter or granddaughter, not yet, but to myself. Letters that held my truths, my pain, and my hopes. I folded them carefully and tucked them away, sometimes reading them aloud in the stillness of the night. These words became a sanctuary, a way to hold myself accountable and to remind myself that I mattered, that I was worthy of love and kindness, even if it had to come from within. The act of writing gave shape to my healing, a way to trace the contours of my journey and to celebrate the small but significant steps I was taking. In this quiet transformation, I found a new rhythm to my days. I woke with intention, moved through tasks with purpose, and rested without guilt. The world outside continued its relentless pace, but inside me, A different time was unfolding, one marked not by loss, but by the slow blooming of self-respect and renewed hope. The kitchen floor, once a place of pain and mockery, now reflected the light of a woman who was learning to stand tall again. This moment was not an end, but a beginning, a midpoint where the past and future met in the fragile balance of a life reclaimed. The peace I had begun to build, fragile and tentative as it was, soon faced its most difficult test. After the slow, deliberate steps I had taken to reclaim my life and dignity, the past came crashing back with the weight of memories and expectations I had tried to leave behind. It began with a letter. An envelope that appeared one morning slipped under my door, stark and unadorned, bearing the familiar handwriting of my daughter. The paper inside was thick, the words carefully chosen but cutting sharper than any raised voice. There was no apology, no offer of understanding or reconciliation. Instead, the letter was filled with accusations and pleas disguised as concern, a litany of grievances that laid blame at my feet for the fractures that had long been present but were now impossible to ignore. She wrote of stress, confusion, and hurt, painting me as the source of turmoil, the one who had abandoned the family rather than the one who had been pushed away. The letter was both a challenge and a demand, an attempt to pull me back into the role I had tried so hard to escape. The dutiful mother who bends to the will of others, who endures silently and accepts whatever scraps of affection are offered. Reading that letter, I felt the familiar sting of betrayal, but also a surprising steadiness. I had anticipated this moment, the attempt to reassert control through guilt and obligation, and I was prepared to meet it with the strength I had gathered in the months since my fall. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, a quiet refusal to be drawn into old patterns that no longer served me. Around the same time, my daughter showed up unannounced at the cafe where I had begun working, her expression unreadable, a mix of fatigue and something I wasn't sure I recognized as regret. She did not come with open arms or heartfelt apologies. Instead, she stood stiffly, as if bracing for confrontation or disappointment. The visit was awkward, marked by careful words and a guarded silence that spoke volumes about the distance that had grown between us. She spoke of family, of the grandchildren, and of the need to find a way forward. But beneath her words lingered the same impatience and judgment that had driven us apart. The legal threats followed shortly after. A lawyer representing my daughter and son-in-law contacted me, speaking in measured tones about concern for my well-being and suggestions for next steps to ensure my safety. The language was clinical and detached, but the message was clear. I was no longer to be trusted with my own affairs, and my independence was being questioned under the guise of protection. It was a reminder that the struggle for agency was not only emotional, but also legal and practical. I listened politely, refusing to let the fear and frustration rise to the surface, and I responded with a firm but calm statement that I was capable, that I was safe, and that any further attempts to control me would be met with resistance. This clash, this battle for respect and recognition, was perhaps the most daunting escalation yet, testing not only my resolve, but the very foundations of the new life I was trying to build. Amidst these challenges, my relationship with my granddaughter became a fragile lifeline. She was caught between loyalty to her parents and a quiet curiosity about the grandmother she had come to see as both distant and mysterious. Her letters were short and tentative at first, filled with questions and expressions of missing me, and over time they became more frequent and open. When she visited, the moments we shared were precious but brief, punctuated by the presence of her mother's watchful eyes and the undercurrent of tension that seemed to follow her everywhere. I cherished those times, knowing they might be fleeting, and I sought to offer her a space free from judgment, where she could simply be herself, not an extension of the fractured family politics swirling around us. The public exposure of my absence came unexpectedly. A local newspaper ran a piece about my disappearance, quoting my daughter's worried statements and casting me as a vulnerable figure lost to my family and community. The article was a mixture of concern and subtle condescension, painting a picture that felt both invasive and inaccurate. I read it with a mixture of amusement and sorrow, recognizing in the words the familiar patterns of dismissal and misunderstanding. This unwelcome attention brought new visitors to the cafe, some kind, others curious, and a few with pity in their eyes. I learned to navigate these interactions with grace, using the moments to assert my dignity and reclaim my narrative in quiet but firm ways. Throughout this second escalation, the emotional pressure was immense, a constant test of my ability to hold on to the sense of self I had begun to rebuild. The demands, the accusations, and the legal maneuvers were not just attempts to control my actions, but assaults on my identity and autonomy. Each interaction required a balance of strength and vulnerability, a refusal to be defined by others' expectations, while remaining open enough to preserve the connections that mattered. The days were filled with moments of exhaustion and doubt, but also with flashes of clarity and resilience that reminded me why I had chosen this path. In the midst of the turmoil, new relationships began to form, offering unexpected sources of support and companionship. Arthur, a quiet man who frequented the cafe, became a steady presence in my life, his gentle kindness and shared stories, a balm to the wounds of estrangement. Joyce, my landlady and companion, offered a practical wisdom and no-nonsense friendship that grounded me when the world felt unsteady. These connections, built slowly and without pressure, reminded me that family and belonging could take many forms, and that healing often comes through the bonds we choose to nurture rather than those we are born into. The pressure from my daughter and her family did not relent, but neither did I. I found new ways to assert my independence, from managing my finances discreetly to setting clear boundaries about visits and communication. I learned to say no without guilt, to walk away from conversations that drained me, and to prioritize my well-being even when it meant disappointing those I once loved deeply. This was not an act of defiance for its own sake, but a necessary step toward reclaiming the respect and dignity that had been eroded over years of neglect and misunderstanding. As the weeks turned into months, the second escalation became a crucible in which my resilience was tested and strengthened. The past and present collided in ways that were painful and sometimes disorienting, but through it all, I held on to a vision of a future where I could live fully and authentically. The laughter that once echoed in the kitchen, the silence that followed, and the challenges that rose like waves against me became part of a larger story, one of survival, transformation, and ultimately, hope. I knew that the journey was far from over, that the scars would remain and the tensions would flare again. But I also knew that I was no longer the woman who had lain on that kitchen floor, vulnerable and unseen. I was a woman who had learned to stand tall, to speak her truth, and to demand the respect she deserved. This second escalation, with all its pain and complexity, was not the end, but a powerful chapter in the ongoing story of reclaiming my life, my voice, and my place in the world. I wrote the letter slowly, deliberately, each word carrying the weight of years spent in silence, of dignity battered but not broken. The pen trembled slightly in my hand, not from weakness, but from the fierce clarity that had taken root inside me. This was not a plea or a cry for understanding. It was a declaration, a line drawn firmly in the sand. For too long, I had been a shadow, a footnote in the stories of others, an obligation to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The letter was my way of reclaiming everything that had been lost: my voice, my power, my self-respect. I told them plainly that I was safe, that I was capable, and that their attempts to control or manipulate me would no longer be tolerated. I was no longer a chapter in their narrative. I was the author of my own. The letter was not a surrender, but a triumph. It was the hardest thing I had done in years, to put on paper a truth so stark and irreversible. I knew that sending it meant closing a door, possibly forever, but I also knew that without this act, I would remain trapped in the limbo of waiting for a permission that would never come. The letter was mailed early one crisp morning, the stamp pressed carefully onto the envelope, as if sealing not just a message, but a new beginning. The act of dropping it into the mailbox felt like shedding a heavy cloak, a physical release of the weight that had settled on my shoulders. I walked away lighter, as if the ground beneath me had shifted to support the woman I was finally becoming. When the response came, it was not what I expected. There was no apology, no heartfelt plea for reunion or reconciliation. Instead, there was silence. For days, weeks, months, no calls, no messages, no visits. The void was vast, and yet in that emptiness, I found a strange peace. Their absence was no longer a wound but a boundary, a space where I could exist without being diminished or controlled. I was free to breathe, to grow, to heal without looking over my shoulder or waiting for approval. The silence became a sanctuary. With the legal threats behind me and the emotional ties loosening, I began to build something new. I found a rhythm in the simple acts of daily life: brewing a cup of tea, tending to the garden, walking the quiet streets near my small apartment. Each step was a testament to my resilience, a quiet defiance against the years of neglect and dismissal. I took pleasure in things I had long forgotten: the warmth of sunlight on my face, the softness of a well-worn book in my hands, the steady companionship of new friends who saw me not as a burden, but as a woman worthy of respect and kindness. The visit from Lisa came unexpectedly, a tentative knock at the door that sent a ripple of memories and emotions through me. She was different, less polished, less certain, her usual sharp edges softened by exhaustion, or perhaps regret. She did not come to plead or demand, but to speak quietly, to acknowledge the chasm that had grown between us. Her words were halting, filled with the awkward honesty of someone who had realized too late the cost of control and cruelty. She spoke of panic, of fear, of mistakes made in haste and anger. But beneath it all was a raw vulnerability that I had not seen in years. I listened, not because I was ready to forgive or forget, but because I was ready to hold space for the complexity of our shared history. I told her gently that I was no longer the woman who would shrink to fit the roles others assigned me, that I had found strength in letting go, and that my future would be shaped by my own choices, not their expectations. Our conversation was not a resolution, but a beginning, a tentative step toward a new kind of relationship defined not by control or obligation, but by honesty and respect. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here, the falls and the laughter, the silences and the confrontations, the moments of despair and the sparks of hope. I realized that this was not just a story of loss, but one of transformation, a testament to the power of reclaiming one's voice and agency, even in the face of betrayal. The kitchen floor where I had fallen remained a symbol, but no longer of humiliation. Instead, it was a reminder of the strength it took to rise. I began to write letters again, this time not to others, but to myself. They were filled with affirmations, memories of joy and love, and promises to hold myself with kindness and courage. I tucked these letters away in a small box, a treasure trove of self-love to draw upon in the darker days. I learned that healing was not a destination, but a process, one that required patience, compassion, and the willingness to keep moving forward despite setbacks. The final act of sending that letter was a reclaiming of my story, a refusal to be silenced or erased. It was a boundary set with clarity and love for myself, a message that I mattered not because of what others demanded, but because I recognized my own worth. The aftermath was not always easy. There were moments of loneliness, doubt, and longing, but each day I chose myself again, step by step, breath by breath. As I look back now, I see that the climax was not a single event, but a series of choices, some small, some monumental, that wove together to create a tapestry of resilience and renewal. It was the moment I stopped waiting for permission to live fully and began living on my own terms. The courage it took to send that letter echoes in every act of self-care, every boundary set, every moment of quiet joy that fills my days. This is the heart of my story. The power to say no to being diminished, to reclaim the space that is rightfully mine, and to walk forward with dignity and hope. If you find yourself in a similar place, feeling invisible, unheard, or undervalued, know that the strength to rise is already within you. You are not alone, and your story is not over. Sometimes, the most powerful act is simply to speak your truth and choose yourself, even when the world expects you to do otherwise. The days that followed the letter's arrival were quiet in a way I had not expected. There was no dramatic return, no sudden change of heart from those who had once dismissed me. Instead, there was a silence that stretched out like a vast, empty room, echoing not with loneliness, but with space. That space became a canvas, blank and waiting, inviting me to paint a new picture of what my life could be. In that stillness, I found a calm I hadn't known for years, a peace born not of forgetting the past, but of learning to live alongside it with grace and acceptance. I realized that this was the true freedom I had sought, the freedom to be myself, fully and without apology. One afternoon, a letter arrived, not from my daughter or son-in-law, but from my grandson. His handwriting was hesitant but sincere, and his words reached across the distance we had created, offering a fragile thread of connection. He spoke of missing me, of wanting to understand, and of hoping we could find a way forward on new terms. There was no demand or expectation, only a quiet invitation to rebuild a bond that had never truly broken, just frayed by time and hurt. I read and reread his letter, feeling a warmth spread through my chest that was both comforting and fragile. It was a reminder that love, in its many forms, can endure even the harshest storms. The meeting with him was gentle and unhurried, held in a modest motel room filled with the soft scent of takeout food and hotel soap. We spoke not as a grandmother and grandson bound by obligation, but as two people seeking to understand and be understood. There were no grand declarations or promises, only honest conversation and shared memories of better days. His presence was a balm to wounds I hadn't fully acknowledged, and in his company I felt the possibility of healing, not a return to what was lost, but a beginning of something new. The embrace we shared at the end was quiet but deep, a silent agreement that while the past shaped us, it would no longer define the future. Back at home, life settled into a new rhythm. The kitchen, once a place of pain and humiliation, became a sanctuary once more. Not because of what it was, but because of what I had made it. I filled it with the sense of cooking and fresh flowers, with laughter from friends who chose to be part of my life, and with the quiet joy of moments lived fully and freely. Each day was a gift, and I embraced it with gratitude and openness. The navy coat I had chosen during the dark days now hung by the door, a symbol of the journey I had taken, from falling and being laughed at to standing tall and being seen. I found joy in simple pleasures, the warmth of the sun on my face, the sound of birdsong in the morning, the comfort of a well-worn book in my hands. I nurtured friendships that honored me, and I made space for solitude without shame. I learned that belonging is not always found in family, but in the hearts of those who see and value us for who we truly are. The resilience I had cultivated became a quiet fire within me, warming even the coldest nights and lighting the path ahead. There were moments of sorrow and longing, of course, echoes of what had been and what might never be. But these were no longer chains binding me to pain. They were threads woven into the tapestry of a life reclaimed. I accepted them as part of my story without letting them dictate my worth or my happiness. The past was a place I could visit without being trapped, a chapter closed but never forgotten. One evening, sitting on the porch with my dear friend Joyce, wrapped in blankets and watching the moon rise, I felt a deep sense of completion. We spoke of the journey, of the falls and the rises, of the courage it takes to choose oneself in a world that often forgets the value of age and experience. She looked at me with eyes full of understanding and said, "You've been here almost 2 months. You planning to stay?" I smiled, feeling the truth of the moment settle within me. "Yes," I said softly. "This house, this life, it's mine now." I reached inside my dresser drawer and found the card I had written to myself in the early days, a message of hope and affirmation taped behind old recipe cards. I smiled as I read the words again. "Dear me, you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back. And look at the life that opened. Well done. Love me." Those words held me steady, a reminder that healing is a journey of love and acceptance, beginning with oneself. To any woman who finds herself in the quiet shadows of neglect, rejection, or invisibility, I offer this. You are not alone, and your story is far from over. It is never too late to choose yourself, to stand up from the floor where you may have fallen, and to walk forward with courage and grace. The journey may be long and winding, but every step taken with love for yourself is a victory. If you listen closely, you will hear your own heart whispering the words you need to hear. You are enough, you are worthy, and you are free. And if you find the strength to begin, come back and tell me. I will be here, sitting in my kitchen, wearing my coat, baking my pies, and waiting to hear your story. Because in the quiet and the stillness, we are never truly alone. We are part of a circle of women who rise, not in spite of our falls, but because of the strength we find in standing again.